MotoGP in 2022 is well and truly back. This is the Crash MotoGP podcast. The recording date is Monday, the 7th of March, the day after the Qatar Grand Prix. My name is Harry Benjamin. Alongside me, Crash MotoGP editor Pete McLaren and former Grand Prix rider and British champion Keith Huewen. Coming up, Moto3 provided some high-octane action, and Moto2 certainly kept us waiting until the final corner to find out who would make it onto the podium. And of course, the main event once again showed us how you can never predict MotoGP with a first-time winner, whilst expected championship contenders found themselves in trouble. Everyone had their eyes set on Ducati, especially with Jorge Martin on pole, but a poor start saw the two Repsol Hondas of Pol Espargaró and Marquez lead the way, and the KTM of Brad Binder right up there as well, along with the Suzuki of Joan Mir. Things started to look fairly settled, Keith, and then it all came undone. And in the end, it was Enea Bastianini who took a fantastic first MotoGP win and an emotional win for Gresini too, Keith, dedicated to the late Fausto Gresini.
I think what you've got to do is look back, first of all, to FP1. We're working our way through Friday and Saturday because, I mean, the Suzukis were somewhere where we didn't expect them to be. They're right on the pace. 8 Ducatis on the grid. What was it one journalist or one particular publication put out there, that the 5 sisters were complaining about the one that had got all the advantages, that being Ducati this year. And what happened to Ducati? Only 4 of them finished, and the one last year's bike ended up winning the race, holding up their honours, obviously. But the fact is that there were surprises all over the place. Zarco didn't even get through to qualifying 2. There was some kind of electrical problem with the Ducati that Jack Miller was riding. It didn't know where it was on the track. Obviously, some kind of GPS type hookup that it has with the electrical system, I would imagine. I'm not that close to it nowadays, so I can't be sure. But there was a lot of problems for Ducati, and yet they still came out, smelling of roses. Unlike Yamaha, the other not such a big surprise really, was it, that they ended up where they were, Quartararo all at sea. And I was thinking this morning before you guys came on that, do you know what? Kenan Sofuoglu has played an absolute blinder here, hasn't he, with Yamaha? Because everyone was shouting and screaming to get Toprak Razgatlioglu involved this year in MotoGP as World Superbike champion. It would have been a disaster for a talent like Toprak to come into a factory that isn't performing at the moment and isn't responding to what their riders want. That's the key for me, is that Quartararo said last year, this is no improvement. We ain't getting where we need to be. Now they're locked in to the performance of that bike for the rest of this year. That's it. They're done. They've got no concessions, so they can't change anything as far as the motor's concerned. They keep on giving us this stuff about, there are lots of other things that we can, give us a bit more performance, a bit more traction at the back, will push us down the straight, rah, 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 rah. But you can't beat a bit of horsepower. The overall race, speed was remarkable. I mean, it was miles faster than last year. I mean, everybody has made a step change except Yamaha, it would seem. I mean, the Hondas look real good. Pol Espargaró threw away a win again with a stupid mistake. Bagnaia took out the pole man, Jorge Martin, with an over-ambitious move up the inside. I think frustration probably getting involved there, and that's something that does happen, obviously.
You think that was
over-ambitious?
There's so
many stories. I mean, pick one, Harry. We could be an hour just doing MotoGP and talking about why people were where they were and where they weren't. I mean, it was just nuts for me.
Just to pick
I'm
up
sorry.
On
Rider of the day, manufacturer of the day, KTM. Brad Binder. Brilliant. I mean, I know Bastianini won the race, rah-de-rah, but for me, KTM made the biggest performance out of what we thought was going to be nowhere.
I wanted to talk about KTM, but I just want to pick up on what you said about Bagnaia as well. You think that was an over-ambitious move then, and not just because he was side by side with him, and then it was Martin said it was quite a scary crash for him in the end.
It was a scary crash. I mean, when you've got someone that dives underneath you, the problem is that when you're watching it on TV and it's sanitised, you can sit back in your big old sofa and watch it and make critical comments and all the rest of it. When you're in 200 mile an hour, into a braking area, under lights, with everything moving around you, with the air, the turbulence that you've got, everything going on, you've got no idea. I've got no idea, despite the fact I've raced a motorcycle at a pretty high level. I've got no idea just how difficult that is. Getting to the end of the straight, hitting your marks, full tank of fuel, all the other bits and pieces that are going on around you. I know they're paid for it. I know they're in tune with their bike, da 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 da. But when you're trying to pinch half a yard nowadays, that is like 10 yards back in the day. These guys are right on the limit all of the time. And Bagnaia, stretched himself just a little bit too much for me. I mean, whatever the reason was in the end, he lost the front end. Really simple. You've got to squeeze. When you're underneath somebody, they're coming down on top of you. You've got a trail brake, you're squeezing it a little bit hard as you're coming into the corner. You've only got a contact area sort of like that that's touching the ground, and unfortunately, he took Jorge Martin out, and it could have been terrible. We know how Jorge Martin has had injuries left, right, and centre in the past. He could have picked up another one. It could have ruined his entire year. This is going to be the toughest year ever in MotoGP. It's the longest season, the most races. We've started earlier. We're going to finish late. There are a lot of back-to-backs, a lot of different tracks this year as well that kind of are going to evolve during the course of the year. And to wreck your year at round one would have been a disaster. It wasn't, as it turned out, so it's good.
Thankfully it wasn't, but of course that was 2 Ducatis out, Pete, wasn't it?
Yeah, I just want to add to that Bagnaia was pretty clear after the race that this all stemmed from this problem, shall we say, in the race, the front end accident, that they'd still been developed. They'd had these issues with the engines, hadn't they? They changed to this sort of hybrid engine. That basically they were still developing parts on the bike right up until free practice 4. They were trying different things, and he was pretty clear afterwards. You could see, I mean, Bagnaia is a calm guy, but he wasn't happy. He said, look, we need to stop changing the bike. We need to just fix the bike. He said, Enea's bike, they've got that bike, it's sorted, you put fuel in it and you ride it. And he said, that's what we need to do. And he said that I mean, okay, he's being prodded by journalists, but he eventually said at one point, look, I'm not a test rider. We need to be racing here. And it's interesting, Keith brought up KTM. KTM have tried to solve exactly that problem, haven't they? That they thought they had last year, where they're testing new things on their Friday practice, and it's setting them back for the whole race weekend. And it almost seems like that's the situation the Ducati guys found themselves in. Certainly Bagnaia was 100% clear on this. He said, look, we've got to stop changing the bike, changing meaning different parts and things. We just need to get the setup, understand the bike, and do a normal race weekend. So that's where he felt the problem sort of stemmed from.
Yeah, but he's speaking as a rider, Pete, and riders will always say that. At the end of the day, he's riding for a factory team. It's their job to innovate. It's their job to find all the little extra bits and pieces. And it's his job to get his head down and get on with it. It's a situation where a rider always wants a stable platform, wants to find that base setting that he can work from. Great, but, when you're riding a factory team, and I do know about this, when they chuck stuff at you, you've got to get over it. You've got to work it out. Sometimes, if they haven't developed it, if it hasn't already been done in testing elsewhere, we've talked about this so many times on this podcast. The fact is, there's not been that much track time, really, for riders to sort this stuff out. And when you've got an innovative team like Ducati that are always bringing something back to the party, I don't actually feel sorry for Bagnaia at all. I feel a little bit that his frustration has leapt out publicly there, and I don't think he'll be thanked much for Ducati for that. The fact is that sometimes when you ride for a factory team, sometimes you're riding a bike that's hard to ride, that's not quite the way it should be if you want it slightly differently. I mean, the example would be maybe Honda. Marc Marquez, I've always said, Honda was developed for Marc Marquez. No one else could ride it anything like Marc Marquez could. And while he was in good nick, it was winning races and championships. Then they've had to change it so that other riders are able to get around it quite as much. And while we're on the subject of Marc, he still ain't quite right. I mean, he says he didn't have any pain from the injuries he's had, previously. But the fact is that Marc Marquez being beaten by Pol Espargaró on the same bike, not if he was right.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it was interesting in warm-up, wasn't it? Marc got behind Pecco Bagnaia, and you could see he got into that race mode, and he started trying to chase him. And what happened? Down he went. He lost the front and he fell. And it was just this new bike. It's got this bias towards the rear grip and things like that. And you just worried after seeing that when he gets into the race and he starts pushing again, as you say, attacking in his usual way, if he could, it's a lot of front end, isn't it? And it just doesn't seem to be working that way for him at the moment. There was 3 moments at turn 1 in 3 laps that cost him first the lead to Pol, and then he dropped behind Bastianini and I think Binder as well. And I think after that it was a case of, well, look, let's just bring it home.
Human psyche is a wonderful thing, and even Marc Marquez has proved now that he is actually human, not quite the alien maybe that we'd all thought he was, because he could pick it up off the floor and go just as fast. That one crash that he had early on, he almost had another one pretty soon off the back of it as well, which would have really sapped his confidence at that point. But when it comes to race day, Marc Marquez normally is not the kind of guy that slips back to where he was. I'm talking about slip back. He didn't slip back that far, but the fact was that, I think as well, we had conditions were very difficult over the weekend there. They weren't stable. You had a lot of sandstorms, and the track wasn't quite as good as it's been in the past. You had, it was really murky on Saturday. You through free practice and qualifying. I mean, it was, not great weather for there, and the weather, the track temperature varied a fair bit over the course of the weekend as well, and that all makes it, when you're looking for that, thousandth of a second here and thousandth of a second there, makes a difference. And who knows, maybe that wasn't quite the way that Marquez is also very good at taking the best out of it now in the race. He kind of learnt that earlier on in his MotoGP career, that sometimes you've got to take the points, and to come away with the points he's come away with puts him in a good position for next time out, and so on. I don't think Marquez is done and dusted by any means at all. It was a surprising weekend. Qatar, as I've said before, is a unique place under the lights. It really, really is. It's a spectacular place. Riders pretty much like the circuit, works for most of them, and we've had a surprising result. Well, hey ho, that's what happens sometimes at the beginning of the year, doesn't it? And then it all settles down. Who was it? I think it was my old mate Julian Ryder who used to say, when we get to the ground war, probably a phrase that I shouldn't use actually in circumstances as we are at the moment in the world, but I know the sentiment that Jules used to come up with this. When we get to the main part where it all really digs in and we all get to the European tracks and the like, we will see the Honda and probably the Yamaha as well making a comeback. I think the big issues, Suzuki looked like they've got a motorbike that's well capable of doing the business. It didn't at the weekend. Ducati, well, there's certainly going to be some soul searching going on there, and they're going to be trying to work out quite what went wrong on all fronts there as well. But when you've got the three most unexpected people that are the main runners for Ducati, and everybody else, the main factory boys, falling by the wayside one way or another, I would have said it was a disaster for Ducati this weekend, masked by the fact that the beast did the business.
That is it, isn't it? All of these people that had really bad races, especially Bagnaia and Miller, they can almost maybe not glass half full, but a bit of something in the glass, shall we say? Because if Marc Marquez had won that race, or one of the favourites, they'd be feeling a lot worse, wouldn't they? I think that's pretty cool.
Very good point. Very good point indeed.
But you talk about how Honda may well get better in the European system, but surely this is a huge weight off their shoulders after what their disastrous last year. Marquez is back on the bike, he's riding well. Espargaro was challenging for the win. This is a massive improvement for them. Surely they'll be buoyed by this.
Well, yeah, I think you probably would be if you got. I mean, Pol. How many times do we see this with Pol Espargaró? A mistake at a certain point in the race that really Pol Espargaró should have won that race. The Honda looked good enough, and he looked good enough. He looked good all through the week, and yet he still didn't. And I think that's the point. You're not going to win a championship if this is the way it goes. The only way, Marc Marquez has taken the points. I would still put money on Marc Marquez over and above Pol Espargaró for a championship any day of the week. It's a situation where Pol's getting on with this bike now. The bike has come to him. Honda have developed a motorbike that's working for him. We've heard the other Honda guys say something similar. But it's still really only Marc Marquez who's going to win him a world title, isn't it?
I mean, I was impressed by Pol, I have to say. I think that after last year, and that whole, what must he have been feeling when he walked out of KTM and then they win those races, and then they even, last year the factory riders won a race each as well, and he had that disastrous year at Honda. I think that, I think it's great. I was happy to see him doing well at the front. It was interesting that he said, look, they went through all the plans before the race, and none of them involved two Hondas at the front of the grid and then pulling away. So, both of the Honda riders changed to the soft front tyre, I think, on the grid. I think it was a last-minute change. They were borderline. They were in between tyres, and they just went with the safer option. Like Marquez said, look, the front, I could feel it a bit more. Things like that. So I think for such a new bike, I think that's the other thing, isn't it? It's such a new bike to be already almost within sight of victory. I think you've
just hit a nail on the head there, Pete. Because under normal circumstances, the default would be a harder front tyre than the rest of the field. The Honda previously would always pretty much be a one step change different from everyone else. It would be, Marc would always want that extra support on the front end of a harder compound. So that is a really interesting observation that both of them, and that will show that the way the motorcycle has changed in its balance. Maybe it'll work for Marc later on in the year. Maybe he'll get his head around it, or maybe Honda will end up changing some of it. back to how he likes it.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Yeah, what will Marc try and move towards the bike, or will he try and move the bike more towards him? Yeah, I think he did say Mandalika will be, he didn't say a better result, but he said it'll be a better weekend because, of course, it'll be in daylight, all the sessions at least, so they can at least work on this bike a bit more. So interesting to see. But as you've been saying about really these first 4 opening races, they're all going to be a bit weird, aren't they? We've had Qatar without any testing and it's a night race. You've got Mandalika, they're going to resurface it. But what's the rest of the track like? I don't think it was just the 20% that they're resurfacing that was the problem, was it? That might be the worst bit, but I don't think the rest of it's in perfect shape. Then you've got Argentina, they haven't been to in 2 years. Coach has been resurfaced. I mean,
You hit another nail on the head there, Pete, in that bit of the conversation as well, when you talk about Marquez and Pol Espargaró and Honda working around the problems that they've got with the new motorbike, whereas Bagnaia was practically complaining about the fact they've got too many bits to try, and that there's the difference between some riders and some psyches, if you like. Marquez is getting his head down to try and sort it all out, whereas Bagnaia's just complained a bit about getting the motorcycle that he doesn't quite want at the minute. They're just going to have to knuckle down and work it out. And you're right. The unfortunate thing about Mandalika and the like is that no real data. And that track wasn't in good condition during the time they tested there. So it's going to be completely different when they get back next time. So FP1, thing is about racing nowadays, free practice is no longer free practice. It's qualifying for qualifying. Free practice 1 is a qualifying session effectively because it compounds through the sessions. If you don't get back to free practice 3, with the top 10 position, you're out of qualifying 2 naturally. You're going through qualifying 1. If you don't get out of qualifying 1, and only 2 riders can, you're screwed. If you start that far back, it's quite interesting. Dr. Martin Rains, if you follow Dr. Martin Rains on Twitter, folks, he's a brilliant guy to follow, really good guy as well. Proper northern dry sense of humour and a very reasonable man, but does brilliant stats. And if you look through his timeline today, after you've listened to us perhaps rambling on, you'll find one stat in there where he looked at where the top 3 qualifiers naturally finish in a race and so on and so forth. And it kind of underlines the fact that if you don't qualify any good, you're pretty well finished. You're not going to be a podium man. And his stats back that up. I know stats and statistics are fairly easy to adjust generally, but not when it comes to racing. And he's got one interesting thread of stats on his timeline. Dr. Martin Rains, folks.
All right, well, let's focus on a couple of the standouts as well, because I want to talk about KTM and Aprilia. Of course, Brad Binder, we've touched on him already, up there in second in the end. KTM's best ever result in Qatar. And Pete, this is great news, great way to start for KTM. But when you look at the other riders in KTM, not so great.
Yeah, exactly, Harry. I mean, I don't think anyone, as Keith said, KTM were really the surprise of a lot of surprises. I mean, the whole podium was a surprise, but Brad Binder, I mean, let's be honest, another lap, he could well have won that race. I mean,
he was on it.
What was he? He was 0.3 at the lap.
He does come good late though, doesn't he, in a race, Brad Binder? And he was That's one of his specialities.
Yes, and he was on the medium tyres, Keith. We've just been speaking about the Honda. He did go with that. Instead of going for the soft, he went for the mediums, and so which we know again the KTM likes, and they've been able to use it. As you say, the most impressive thing with Binder is that it's not been a KTM track. This has been one of their worst tracks traditionally since they've come back to MotoGP. So to be so strong here, we know last year they were struggling with traction out of the corners. Binder was saying that the bike was really great going into the corners this time. He said, you can just take your hands off the brakes if you like and just roll it in. Whereas before you had to really sort of hold the brake and drag it in and that kind of thing. And he used the word solid. He said the bike's solid. So, Brad Binder and a solid bike is quite a combination.
I can't believe it. The sun's
Keith,
come out.
I was going to say, it's like you're in heaven. You're shining. You're glowing.
I'm glad I wore a T-shirt. I can't believe it. It's absolutely beautiful here in Northamptonshire.
Very sunny. For those who aren't watching on the YouTube, you can see Keith in all his glory on the Crash MotoGP YouTube channel.
With my free bike shed T-shirt.
Give that a plug. There we go. But as Pete says, absolutely, it was a stonking race from Brad Binder. But and then let's talk about Aprilia, Keith, as well. Espargaro up.